Hello everyone, Linda Edwards here. Today I'd like to read to you a small excerpt from my new novel, Friendship Estate. I'm happy to be back in Jamaica again, even if it's in the late 1700s. Here goes. Lyndon Holborn, master of Friendship Estate, lay on his deathbed on the 19th of August in the year of our Lord, 1786. Dawn was creeping over the mountains and would soon light up the Caribbean Sea. He could see the waves from his bed and tried to concentrate on breathing in with each incoming wave and out as it kissed the sandy shore and turned back toward the pull of the sea. He knew he was dying, but he still had things to do before he closed his eyes forever. His second wife was much younger than he was. He had set aside his English wife and 3 children when he met her, sent them back to England with enough money and a promise that he would never hear from them again. As the ship sailed out of the Jamaican harbour, he took for his wife the love of his life, Aunt Beauchamp. She was born in Haiti, and he met her there when he travelled to her father's estate to buy slaves. Her father was a Basque prince from the Kingdom of Navarre. The small principality occupied lands on either side of the Western Pyrenees, along the Atlantic Ocean between Spain and France. Anne's mother was a slave, but when the prince laid eyes on her, he married her the next day. He could have taken her without marrying her, as was his right as master of the plantation, but he was so madly in love and out of his mind with lust for her that only the marriage bond would satisfy him and be acceptable to her. It was whispered that Anne and her mother practiced magic, deep from the heart of Africa, so powerful they could bend the will of any man. Given how they were able to entice rich and powerful men to fall in love with them, seemingly overnight, the rumour took flight as their fortunes improved. Anne bore Lyndon a daughter she christened Sabine. Lyndon didn't think he could love anyone more than he loved Anne, until he saw the perfect bundle the midwife laid in his arms, with flawless mocha skin, a rosebud of a mouth, and beautiful dark eyes, the mirror of his own Anne's eyes. He fell in love all over again, and vowed he would give this child everything he had. He spared no expense in bringing tutors to the island of Jamaica, to ensure she could read, write, and speak English and French fluently, debate the history and politics of any nation, understand the science of crops, yields, harvests, and manage her finances, which included the most abundant sugar plantation on the west coast of Jamaica. He worked to ensure that she would never have to rely on anyone for her livelihood. He raised her as he would have his only male heir. Now as he lay at death's door, he worried that he had failed her. His English breeding and enormous wealth had purchased her acceptance into Jamaican plantocracy society. But would it be enough to silence the whispers of half-caste and browning that occasionally floated to his ears? He had done the unthinkable in Jamaica's polite society. He had put aside his white family and made his life with his darky family. He now worried that he would bring the life he had created crashing down around them with his death. He had one card left to play, one given to him by his father-in-law, the Prince of Navarre. He asked his friend and confidant, Dr. Richard Chapman, to attend him today, so he could play his last hand in protecting the child he loved. Richard, thank you for coming. Lyndon was pulled from his reverie as his friend took the seat next to his bed. He tried to raise himself to shake his hand, but a coughing fit left him weak and spasming as he fell back against his pillow. Anne rushed to his side and gently propped him up against her so he could speak. I'm afraid I have little time left in this world, and I need to ask you a favor, my friend. Anything, Lyndon, anything for you. Richard addressed the older man earnestly. Richard Chapman had arrived from England battered and broken. He came from a good family in England, not royalty or gentry, but hard-working folk who had improved their lot from storekeeper to proprietors of a shipping fleet to learned doctors and lawyers. He had just finished his studies as a doctor and was to join a flourishing practice in London when his father was disgraced and died in a mysterious fire that killed his mother and young sisters. His father lost a shipment of slaves at sea. He had undertaken the venture on the word of a nobleman, who he later learned was penniless and needed the money from the sale of slaves he had procured off the coast of Africa. Richard's father sent all his ships without a deposit or guarantee from the nobleman, and with great reluctance, because it was during the height of the hurricane season. The vessels were all lost at sea, along with their cargo, and the nobleman held his father responsible. He used his influence to get a judgment against his father, claiming all his assets except the family home. Richard could never prove it, but he knew it was the nobleman's lackeys who set the fire that killed his family. Richard's society fiancée had refused to marry him after the scandal because he had nothing left in England. In disgrace, he had fled to Jamaica. His luck changed the day he met Lyndon Holborn, who asked nothing of him except friendship, until this day, the day he lay dying in his bed. "Tell me, my friend, how may I help you?" Richard asked gently. He knew Lyndon was dying, and was anxious to ease the anxiety he had seen on the old man's face as he attended him this past week. He moved into the great house to be closer to his friend, in case he needed anything. "Do you know the law of primogeniture, what it entails?" Lyndon asked. "I do, yes. According to English law, the firstborn legitimate son will inherit your entire estate," Richard started. "Yes, correct. That's it," Lyndon cut him off. "Are you worried that your son will come from England to claim your estate?" Richard asked. "No, my firstborn son is dead, years past of dysentery, and my English daughters have married well and have lives of their own. I suspect they have happily forgotten about me and about Jamaica years ago." Another coughing fit overcame Lyndon, and he stopped to take a drink from the cup Anne held to his lips. "I want to talk to you about the law of absolute primogeniture. It's from the Basques, written in the laws that govern the Kingdom of Navarre. Anne's father was a prince of Navarre. Absolute primogeniture allows me to transfer the title of my property to any child of mine regardless of their sex." "Lyndon, all your property is in Jamaica, thus governed by the laws of England," Richard started, but Lyndon interrupted him. "Anne, give him the document," Lyndon instructed. From behind her, Anne produced a long leather tube. Richard could see the insignia of the Kingdom of Navarre engraved into the leather. "Read this and let me know if you understand what it says," Lyndon instructed. Richard carefully removed the fragile parchment and laid it out at the foot of the bed to see it better from the window's light. He read carefully, looking at Lyndon and Anne from time to time. Their eyes never left his face. When he finished reading, he walked to the window, but he saw nothing of the beautiful vista in front of him. He could not believe what he had just read. Friendship Estate, and all on it was the sole property of the Kingdom of Navarre and its heirs, born in the colonies. As an only child, Anne owned it all, and as her sole heir, so would Sabine. "There is no way this will hold up in an English court of law," Richard stated. "It already has," Lyndon said. He was tired and his energy was fading fast. "When I married Anne, her father petitioned King George to ratify that document, which he did. It does not have to go through the English courts. It is by royal decree." "This will create a scandal that Anne and Sabine will never recover from. What have you done, Lyndon?" Richard asked. "Anne is my other half, my equal, my better in many ways." He smiled and kissed his wife's hands as he said this. "My daughter is my only heir. She will inherit Friendship Estate and do wonderful things with it, I'm sure. But I need your help." "My help? How can I help?" Richard asked incredulously. Lyndon took a deep breath before answering. "After a reasonable period following my death, I want you to marry Anne." "What?" Anne and Richard exclaimed together. "Anne, you have no family in Jamaica," Lyndon explained. "Your father turned his plantation over to your mother's family upon his death. That property is now a freehold, as it should be. Jamaica is a mixed-race island, Anne. We both know it. There are few purer Africans each year, as there are fewer pure Englishmen. The abolition of slavery is around the corner, and I need you, Sabine, and Richard to prepare this plantation. Hell, prepare the entire island that bore our daughter for what is to come." Lyndon lay back, his energy spent. The resolve in his outburst had surprised them all. Anne and Richard looked at each other. They were close in age, Richard being 2 years older than Anne. The only thing they had in common was their love for Lyndon, and they both understood why he wanted this marriage. Richard's name and white skin would protect Anne and Sabine. He would give them the legitimacy they needed to live life as they had, and no one in Jamaica would question them. It was the perfect solution for their bona fide continued existence. With tears in her eyes, Anne nodded her head in agreement. Richard followed suit as Lyndon hugged them both to him. Richard and Anne looked at each other over his head. What choice did they have but to grant the man they owed everything to his dying wish? They were still looking at each other when Lyndon took his last breath. Chapter 2. Mount Sion. Lord Harrington Dunbarton, the 6th Duke of Argyll, was not a happy man. He had a problem, and he had no idea how to solve it. It was a common problem for past Dukes of Argyll, so he was particularly annoyed that he could find no solution. In England, the Dunbarton name was associated with deceit, rape, theft, even murder. The final straw for the royal crown came at the hands of the 4th Duke of Argyll, Gordon Dunbarton, Harrington's grandfather. Coveting neighbouring lands, he counted on the good manners of the lord of said lands, even though there were generations of bad blood between the two families. He imposed himself and his fighting force on the reluctant lord of the manor to shelter them as they passed through his lands on a stormy night. As their host slept, he and his men slaughtered every man, woman, and child in their sleep. Unknowingly, they had left one witness alive. Brimming with arrogance and self-satisfaction, Lord Gordon Dunbarton presented himself at King George's court, presuming to claim the lands based on the lord's death, along with all his heirs. Imagine his surprise when he walked into the throne room to find the youngest son of the murdered lord sitting at the king's feet. The king proclaimed him to be an unscrupulous reprobate, banishing him from court forever. As punishment for his crimes, the king levied a large fine on the Dunbarton estate, taking all the income from their landholdings in England. In disgrace, Gordon left England for Jamaica to take possession of a coffee plantation he had won in a game of cards. By Jamaican standards, Bellevue was a small estate. Coffee barely made enough for him to live at the standard to which he was accustomed. In his opinion, the island of Jamaica only had one redeeming factor: slave girls that he could rape and abuse without recourse. Harrington's father, the 5th Duke of Argyll, Lord Harold Dunbarton, stayed in England, trying to reclaim the family's lost fortune. Harold was a good-looking young man, with a glib tongue that earned him favour with young ladies whose only ambition was to improve their standing by becoming Lady of the Manor Argyll, humble as it may be. He snagged the beautiful and wealthy widow, Camille Langley, whose husband had died, leaving her a sugar merchant's fortune. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Harold's disappointment in having to live in social exile, shunned by all his royal peers, manifested itself with intolerable cruelty toward Lady Dunbarton, exceeded only by the rapaciousness with which he went through her money. She died while giving birth to his only son, Harrington, the 6th Duke of Argyll. Her great friend, Lady Campbell, the king's consort, made such a stink over the depraved condition of Lady Argyll when she died that Harold was summoned to court, this time told to leave England once and for all. The court would no longer tolerate the dishonourable and disreputable behaviour of the Dunbartons of Argyll. So, tail between his legs, he had fled to Jamaica with his infant son. Gordon Dunbarton was barely eking out a living on the coffee estate, and none too happy to have any more mouths to feed, until Harold drunkenly confessed to Gordon the details of the dwindling fortune he still had access to in England. In turn, Harrington had grown up at his father's knee, listening to his drunken ravings about the unfairness he was treated with by the English court, the crown, and the woman he had married. The money was just running out when Harry, as Harrington was dubbed, went back to England, to the crumbling Argyll manor, to snag another rich wife. He had spent a year in his efforts. No one in England would have anything to do with a Dunbarton of Argyll, even 2 generations removed. He was forced to go to Scotland to find a bride, the stunning Margaret Mackenzie, whose father was chief of the Mackenzie clan. He too had lost favour with the English crown. His family had been the fighting arm of the Jacobite army. Margaret's father was desperate to win back the good favour of the English crown. Despite Margaret's warnings that the Duke of Argyll would not achieve that end, but quite the opposite, her father refused to listen to her when she begged him not to make her marry Harrington Dunbarton. Fooled by Harry's aristocratic looks, title and estate in Jamaica, he demanded that she marry Harry. Against her wishes, Margaret married. Lord Harrington Dunbarton hastily dispatched himself and his wife back to Jamaica with a hefty dowry that Harry managed to get topped off regularly until now. Therein lay his problem. He had just received word of his father-in-law's death. Margaret's older brother had taken his place as chief of the Mackenzie clan and was no fan of Harry's. Shortly after the birth of their only son Brixton, Margaret's brother had visited Jamaica to check on his favourite sibling and welcome her son into the clan Mackenzie. What he found was a battered and bruised Margaret, the result of her husband's attention. Incensed by his sister's abuse, he gave Harry a proper thrashing and promised that as soon as he was chief, all financial support to Harry would stop, instead held in trust until his son came to claim it on his mother's behalf. Margaret had happily presented him with the letter she received from Scotland that very day. So happy to hear the news of Harry's impending financial disaster, she could have cared less about mourning the death of her father, who she felt had sold her into hell. Harry would have loved to pummel her into submission, as she tossed him the letter, laughing as he read it. His urge to hurt her was overwhelming, but some force beyond his ability to overcome stopped him. He could hear her laughing as he stomped out of the house, pacing up and down the long veranda as he yelled at the nearest slave to find his son and send him directly to Harry without delay. Brixton Dunbarton was shirtless, his trouser cuffs turned up to his knees as he stood in the mud barefoot. The only thing that differentiated him from the surrounding slaves was his skin colour, deeply tanned as he was from the days spent out in the Jamaican sun. Slung over his naked and muscled shoulders was a canvas bag. As he picked coffee beans and tossed them into the bag, he blew the blonde hair that had escaped the ponytail at the nape of his neck out of his eyes, his hands never missing a beat, as he quickly picked the precious coffee beans at their exact peak of readiness. He looked to his right to find Dexter working as quickly as he was. They both knew they had to get the crop harvested today, or the estate would lose the only profit they would see this season. They were short of hands. Dexter had rallied all the slaves on the estate, even pulling them from the work details they sent to other smaller farms to supplement the estate's income. They all worked feverishly to harvest the crop before the angry dark clouds in the distance crashed ashore, taking their meagre profit with the tearing winds. For the 100th time Brixton cursed his father. If the man did not have such a terrible drinking problem, coupled with a lousy gambling habit, they would not always be this hard up for funds. The man went through money like a waterfall went through water. So engrossed in his thoughts, he did not hear the little girl calling his name. When Dexter nudged him and pointed to her with his head, he focused his attention on her. Mass Brix, your papa calling for you, she yelled excitedly, tugging at his arm to follow her. I can't leave now, Pearlie. You're going to have to tell my papa to wait, Brixton answered, never taking his eyes from his work. The little girl began to cry. No, Mass Brix, you have to come, or your papa say you're going to beat me till me dead. She kept tugging at his arm. Brixton looked at Dexter and sighed. They both knew it was no idle threat. He removed the bag from his shoulders and slung it over the girl's shoulders. Take my place, but just pick as far up as you can reach. When I come back, I'll pick what you can reach. Dex, you better come with me, Brixton said as he patted the girl's head, wiping her tears, and set her to the task. Dexter nodded, taking his brimming bag and handing it off to the old slave who was placing the picked beans into the donkey-drawn cart that would take them to the sorting house. What fresh hell is this? Dexter muttered as he followed Brixton to the house. Brixton stopped only to wash his feet and pull on a shirt. His father hated to see him dressed down as he was, and he wanted to get this interruption over with so he could get back to work. He found his father agitated, pacing up and down the long veranda. As he saw Brixton, he started yelling at him. "Well, your feckless mother's done it again. She's the cause of our new woes." Brixton's face hardened immediately. He knew his father was lying, but he was agitated enough for Brixton to realize something serious had happened. He stopped and rested one foot on the bottom step that led up to the veranda, wrapped around the cut-stone greathouse. Dex stopped several feet behind him and waited. It wouldn't be the first time he'd have to pull Brixton off his father. He danced on the balls of his feet, waiting. "I'm trying to save our crop. I don't have time for your hysterics now." Brixton was ready to turn on his heel and go back to harvesting. "Your grandfather is dead, boy. Your mother got word today. Do you know what that means? Let me tell you what that means. There will be no more money coming from Scotland. Nothing for us to live on." Harry was getting more worked up with each word. "Good. With no money, there'll be nothing to buy your rum, and nothing for you to gamble with." "All in all, I think this is good news," Brixton said. "Now I have to get back to the one thing that may feed us through the next few months." Brixton turned to leave, but his father's next words stopped him. "I'll sell some land. That's what I'll do. I'll sell Mount Sion." His father knew this would stop Brixton dead in his tracks. Brixton turned slowly to face his father. Dexter moved closer to him. Mount Sion was the most beautiful property in Jamaica. The Santa Cruz mountain range, or the Twins as the slaves called them, because the ridges angled like two alligators facing each other, the tail of the ancient reptile resting on the edge of the 600-acre property. The fertile hills gently sloped down to green fields that stopped at the edge of a flawless stretch of white sand beach. Mount Sion was part of the Bellevue estate, but lay fallow because there was never enough money to do anything with it. It was Brixton's favorite place in the world, and the property his father put in trust for him. He and Dexter had talked endlessly about what they would do with Bellevue and Mount Sion after Harry died. "You wouldn't dare," Brixton challenged him. "Oh, but I would," Harry exclaimed. "That Holborn bastard has wanted it for years. Even on his deathbed he would give me a pretty price for it." Harry was always at his best when he was manipulating someone. Lyndon Holborn's massive estate bordered Mount Sion, and he had often asked about purchasing it. Margaret, the bitch, had made him put it in a trust for Brixton, but she had no money now, so she had no sway over him. Honestly, how he had agreed to do it in the first place still baffled him. Dexter grabbed Brixton just as he started pounding up the steps. His father took a step back in dismay. "Don't do it, Brix. He's not worth it. We'll figure something out," Dexter whispered in his ear. If looks could kill, Harry would have died on the spot, and he knew it. Brixton stopped his ascent, but did not take his eyes off his father. He had never hated the man more than he did at that moment. "If you leave this veranda before I get back tonight, I will hunt you down and kill you with my bare hands. Lyndon Holborn is a good man, and he is dying. You will not, and I repeat not, bother him or his family during this troublesome time. Do you understand me, you hateful excuse of a man?" Harry nodded. He felt genuine fear. Never had Brixton spoken to him in that manner, and he was actually frightened. Brixton's eyes shifted from his father long enough to nod his head, acknowledging his mother as she came out to see what all the commotion was about. She handed Harry the bottle of rum she had brought with her. She nodded at Brixton. She would make sure his father was too drunk to go anywhere, but that did not neutralize the threat he had made, and they both understood that. Dusk was just beginning to set in as the last coffee bean was plucked from its branch and secured in the donkey cart. Brixton was physically and emotionally drained. His anger at his father had pushed him like never before, and by the grace of God they had harvested the precious coffee. Angrily he strode to the horse stable. Still naked to the waist and barefoot, he jumped on his horse and galloped off toward Mount Sion. Dexter saw him leave and realized he needed time to cool down. Dexter was a slave born on the estate. His mother had been a slave, and her mother before her. Harold Dunbarton was master of the estate, and he had known no crueler man. Brixton Dunbarton would one day be master. He waited patiently for that day, because he knew no finer man than Brixton. He understood why Mount Zion was so important to Brixton. He knew why Brixton was so upset at his father's words. Brixton pushed the horse to go faster. Born on Bellevue Estate, he had learned to ride without a saddle before learning to ride with one. He had grown to hate his father as much as he had grown to love his mother. From her and Nana he had learned the value of women. They were always to be treated with dignity and respect, a lesson some of his ancestors had never known. Nana had been his father's nanny, and the only person his father seemed to regard, albeit grudgingly. His great-grandfather had bought her before his grandfather had come to Jamaica. Nana had run the great house for as long as he could remember. No one, not even Margaret, knew precisely how old Nana was, but nothing happened on the estate that she did not know about or sanction. It was because of her that Dexter lived in the great house. The boys, one a slave and one a master, had been raised as brothers from infancy. Never had either questioned their position on the estate. But times were changing, and they understood what that would eventually mean for both of them. Brixton rode the horse into the sea and threw himself into the waves, kicked up by the storm offshore. He prayed the waves would wash away the anger that roiled inside him before he had to face his father again. He didn't know how much longer he could contain the hate and rage he felt toward him. He took off, diving into the waves, cutting deeply into them for the swim he hoped would silence the despair he was feeling. He was on his way back to shore when he looked up to see Dexter sitting on a horse, his foot casually slung across the saddle horn as he reached for Brixton's horse, who was getting more and more anxious as the churn of the waves grew. Brixton swam toward the beach, pulling himself out of the water, as Dexter backed out of the waves on his horse, leading Brixton's horse out. Exhausted, Brixton flew himself onto the sand. Eyes closed, he put one arm behind his head. "Feeling better?" Dexter asked casually. Brixton opened one eye and looked at him. "I guess not," Dexter mumbled. Brixton sat up, his arms on his knees, resting his head in his hands. "You know as well as I do why we can't lose Mount Zion." "I do," said Dexter. "We're barely holding on as it is. Coffee does not make the same money sugar does. Your idea to hire out some of our workforce has brought in the cash flow we need, but we both know without that money from Scotland, we cannot afford to keep my father from looking at ways to supplement his income. If he finds out what we have been doing—" Brixton's voice trailed off. Dexter looked toward the mountain range. It held the secret to the real reason Brixton wanted to hold on to Mount Zion. "We'll think of something, Brix, we always do. The moon will not be out tonight, and the storm will be upon us by morning. Nana wants us to go over to the Arcadia plantation tonight. We both need to eat and get some rest before we go. Avoid your father tonight. We'll talk to Nana and figure this out. Don't worry," Dexter assured him. Brixton stood up, shaking the sand off, and stretched. "You always tell me not to worry. You know it doesn't stop me from worrying, right?" Brixton responded before turning toward his horse, stopping as he noticed the lone figure on horseback. The horse and rider were on the hill that overlooked the beach. He couldn't see the rider's face, but from the way she sat in the saddle and the command she had of her horse, he recognized who it was immediately. Nodding his head toward the hill, he mounted the horse in one sweeping motion. "We have company," he said to Dex. Looking in the direction Brixton had motioned with his head, he turned toward the lone figure on the hill. "Who would be crazy enough to be roaming the countryside as a storm approaches?" he asked Brix. "Oh, she'll make it home before the weather gets bad. She's the best rider in Jamaica. This is nothing for her," he said as he turned his horse toward home. "Race you," he challenged Dex as he took off. Dex turned his gaze slowly from the figure on the hill. From Brixton's description, he knew who it was, and he understood why Brixton was not happy to see her on his land. Thank you for listening to the first 2 chapters of Friendship Estate. I hope you enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it. Friendship Estate is available with all major book retailers.